Excellencies, senior officials, ladies and gentlemen, Bulvinaka, and a very good morning, afternoon, and evening from Suva, Fiji. And welcome to the 13th session of the WTO Global Aid for Trade Stocktaking Event 2021. I am Zarak Khan, the Director of Programs and Initiatives of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, and I will be the moderator of today's session, which focuses on how regionalism and regional aid for trade can support economic recovery and resilience in the Pacific region. In particular, today's session will explore the regional aid for trade approaches pursued by our main development partners and discuss opportunities for further coordination and engagement in priority areas for regional action. Without a doubt, trade remains the cornerstone of our members' development strategies, and one of the very reasons why the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat was established back in 1971. For small countries like ours, domestic demand will never be enough to stimulate competitive production processes and generate decent employment opportunities for all. This is why increasing exports of Pacific goods and services in areas of comparative advantage remain the most viable option to promote economic development in the Pacific region. At the same time, our limited national capacities limit the options which are available to boost trade and call for robust regional actions to complement country-level interventions. By endorsing a 5-year new Pacific Aid for Trade strategy in 2020, foreign trade ministers identified top priorities for regional action. These are connectivity, services, e-commerce, and deepening foreign markets, with the latter including quality infrastructure, trade facilitation, access to trade finance, and trade agreements. Over the past few years, the Secretariat has launched a number of ambitious regional initiatives focused on the priority areas of the Pacific Aid for Trade strategy. Thanks to the generous support of like-minded donor partners and in partnership with first-class implementing agencies such as the World Bank, UNCTAD, UNIDO, the ITC, the WTO, and the German and Australian Metrology Institutes, Standards Australia, and others. For example, in the area of standards and conformance, the Secretariat is coordinating what is known as the Pacific Quality Infrastructure Initiative, which is aimed at increasing the quality of goods and services produced by our members so as to satisfy the requirements of international buyers of our goods and services. A Pacific e-commerce initiative has also been launched, which is proposing to leverage regional coordination and cooperation to increase digital trade readiness and address the challenges posed by our geographical isolation. On trade agreements, the Secretariat is working to modernize and expand the regional trade agreements between its developing country members, known as the Pacific Island Countries Trade Agreement, and to establish regional trade arrangements between these members and today's major trading partners. COVID-19 has indeed produced a very significant impact on the Pacific region. Whilst swift border closures and internal social distancing restrictions have spared our region a humanitarian catastrophe, these same measures have also amplified the trade-induced impacts on our economies. Trade and tourism services, the main engine of growth for most of our members, has essentially come to a halt, but also merchandise trade, which has been negatively impacted by declining global demand and disruptions in air and sea connectivity. This has caused a sharp decrease in the regional real GDP by almost $950 million to now $37.5 billion in 2020. With less economic activities to support jobs and family incomes, and with increased poverty, inequality, and family hardships faced by our Pacific Islanders. I do strongly believe that in this COVID-19 era, regional solutions remain vital to support economic recovery and resilience. For example, the establishment of the Regional Trade Facilitation Scheme, known as the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway, has been important to facilitate distribution of essentials and medical personnel to combat the virus in the Pacific. Looking ahead, regional health and safety standards will be crucial to attract foreign visitors back to our Pacific Islands, and a sound regional ecosystem for e-commerce will be essential to sustain economic activity whilst preserving social distancing. But what's the view of our partners and members? Is regionalism and regional aid for trade an answer to our quest for recovery and resilience? To answer these questions, we are very fortunate to have with us today a truly distinguished panel. Ladies and gentlemen, in line with today's agenda, I will first ask our panelists to share their views on aspects which help frame an answer to our main question. After having heard from our panelists, we should have some time for a Q&A session, and participants have the option to pose questions to our panelists via the Q&A tab that's provided in your Zoom platform. I will then select some of these questions to inform our Q&A session. So colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I am now introducing our first panelist, Ms. Jenna Diallo. Jenna is the Deputy Chief of the Office of the Economic Development and Governance at Usaid in the Philippines, which also covers the Pacific Island countries. She has spent 20 years in international development, with a focus on private sector development with both Usaid and the Export-Import Bank of the United States. Dear Jenna, the United States engagement with the Pacific region is on the rise. The new development assistance comes under the umbrella of the Pacific Pledge, one of the pillars of the United States Indo-Pacific strategy, and includes numerous aid for trade activities. Can you answer for us what's the economic development model that the United States Indo-Pacific strategy proposes for the Pacific? And how is your aid for trade assistance supporting this model? Jenna, you have 6 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we're spread across multiple time zones. I'd like to thank you for inviting me today and to acknowledge all my fellow panelists. USAID's support for trade includes both bilateral support and support for multilateral programs, such as the World Bank's Trade Facilitation Support Program and the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. USAID's experience in supporting countries across various aspects of trade includes conducting WTO trade facilitation needs assessments, analysis of regulations and policies, addressing firm-level challenges to exporting, including streamlining customs procedures, and decreasing the time it takes to export. We value partnership with the private sector and often work with the business sector in advocating for changes to make it easier to engage in trade. Our approach is influenced by our private sector engagement policy and our new digital strategy. Private sector engagement policy, which was launched in 2019, USAID sees it as a top priority to consult, strategize, align, collaborate, and implement with the private sector for greater scale, sustainability, and effectiveness. We recognize that private investment is the only sustainable solution to the Indo-Pacific's economic and infrastructure needs. Our digital strategy, which was launched last year, has the goal to achieve and sustain open, secure, and inclusive digital ecosystems that contribute to broad-based, measurable development and increase self-reliance in emerging market countries. E-commerce is growing and of course has become extremely important this past year with the COVID pandemic and the way it's impacted movement. And it's creating new opportunities for MSMEs to engage in trade. One program that showcases our approach to supporting trade is a program called the E-Trade Alliance, which was launched in 2019 and is a partnership between USAID and 10 leading private sector companies, including Cargill, DHL, MasterCard, and PayPal, whose goal is to increase the number of MSMEs engaged in international e-commerce, as well as the value and volume of MSMEs' digital trade. The Alliance has 5 work streams: policy and enabling environment, skills development at the firm level, trade facilitation and logistics, access to finance, and inclusive trade. As we look at expanding our work to support economic growth and trade in the Pacific Islands, we will look to follow this type of model. Just to show just a few examples of how we've supported in the past, up to now, we've supported more than 28 countries in conducting WTO trade facilitation needs assessments. And the E-Trade Alliance, which I just mentioned, despite delays in activities due to COVID-19, has been able to leverage nearly $2.4 million to train over 700 SMEs, sensitize and train policymakers, regulators, private sector, and industry association leaders around the world on e-commerce policy and initiatives best practice, and onboard more than 83,000 SMEs onto electronic platforms. The E-Trade Alliance also developed the first rigorous framework and actionable empirical analysis of regulations and policies needed for SMEs to thrive as sellers and exporters on global digital platforms. The framework analyzed digital and e-commerce regulations and policies in 6 key areas in approximately 40 countries, and will expand to cover 50 countries and 8 main issue areas. So I'll save some other examples of other work we've done and talk about our future work for later in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenna, for your insightful presentation. I'm now pleased to introduce our second speaker, Mr. Bill Costello, who is connected from Canberra. Bill is the Assistant Secretary in the Office of the Pacific of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or DFAT. Bill has been a development professional for more than 30 years and a member of the Australian Aid and DFAT's senior executive from 2008. His previous executive roles include Minister Counselor at the Australian Embassy in Washington, Head of DFAT's Ebola Task Force, Assistant Secretary in DFAT's Humanitarian Division, Assistant Director General for the Pacific, and Head of Usaid in Papua New Guinea. Dear Bill, Australia is probably one of the most supported partners of regional initiatives promoted by the Foreign Secretariat, as well as other agencies in the Pacific. The Australian government is also one of the Pacific's main aid for trade partners, supporting a range of regional, bilateral, and multilateral aid for trade initiatives across all categories of aid for trade. Can you respond in terms of how Australia has pivoted its support in the context of the economic impacts of COVID-19, especially from a regional perspective? Bill, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Zarak, for that very kind introduction. And can I say it's a privilege and a pleasure to talk on this topic. We're particularly pleased as a co-organiser for this side event, and we welcome all the panellists and the participants around the world into this discussion. I want to also welcome the WTO's initiative to hold the Aid for Trade stocktake this year under these unusual circumstances, and the opportunity we have today to share the Pacific's unique trade and development challenges and opportunities. And can I thank the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, especially you, Zarak, but also Andrea in the Geneva office of the PIFs for the hard work in putting this event together. Just before I get to the specifics on COVID as requested by Zarak, I just want to make a few more general points about our policy position and why aid for trade is so important in our minds. And I'll start by saying the obvious, which is that trade helps countries to grow, prosper, and raise living standards for all. We recognise that developing countries need support and can benefit from support to maximise the benefits from trade, which is why we're a long-standing supporter of the role that aid for trade can play in addressing critical supply-side constraints and building productive capacity. Australia's ongoing commitment to provide aid for trade in the Pacific is part of our broader Pacific Step Up, and our Step Up is about expanding and deepening our partnerships in the region. Turning to Australia's regional aid for trade in the Pacific, our finding is that regional approaches complement our global and our Pacific bilateral policies and programs in support of a stable, secure and prosperous Pacific. While Pacific Island countries are very diverse, they also share some characteristics which present distinct combined challenges impacting their ability to benefit from trade and which lend themselves to regional approaches. And I'm now going to go through the list of challenges the Pacific faces, which we've all heard many times before, but we have to remind ourselves that these are what makes the Pacific so unique. The level of geographic isolation and fragmentation of the populations of the Pacific is unparalleled anywhere in the world. Its vulnerability to natural disasters is very high. The small populations and small markets can be a barrier to achieving economies of scale, of course. There's limited productive capacity in a number of the Pacific countries. And of course, that leads to narrow export bases and markets, high trade and transport costs, and limited infrastructure and connectivity. And of course, capacity gaps in key areas, such as the capacity to meet sometimes very exacting export market standards, particularly from developed country partners. Now, that's all known, but our deep view is that while those natural and geographic challenges will remain, regional economic integration and connectivity can and will help to mitigate them and reduce some of the capacity and other constraints that are faced by Pacific countries. Our regional aid for trade effort therefore seeks to support the region's inclusive, sustainable economic development through enhanced regional economic integration and connectivity. We seek to do this by boosting regional trade and investment, addressing key business enabling environment issues and promoting private sector development, increasing market access opportunities, including through improved ability to meet standards. And I should say that as a key trading partner of the Pacific, that means helping Pacific countries to access our market very directly, reducing red tape and trade costs through trade facilitation, assistance to undertake trade reform to enable freer movement of goods, services and people, and related adjustment support, promoting labour mobility and skills development, including through managed government programs such as the Pacific Labour Scheme, which are partly aid funded but also industry driven, including not least by Australian industry, supporting high quality connectivity related infrastructure projects, for example, by a new dedicated Australian infrastructure financing facility for the Pacific. Zarak, you mentioned the Pacific Aid for Trade Strategy 2020 to 25. We see that as an important regional guide for development partners as it complements national efforts on trade development in several ways. First, it creates a link between aid and trade priorities and the long-term economic development objectives of the region and its individual member countries. Second, it provides a framework for collaboration and tracking among member states and international development partners with an interest who are providing support in this area. Third, it provides an evidence-based and provides regionally owned priorities. And finally, it enables donors to better coordinate their resources and programs. Our regional aid for trade efforts are aligned with the Pacific Aid for Trade strategy priorities. We're directly supporting several projects coordinated by PIFs under the strategy, for example, funding the Regional Quality Infrastructure Project together with the EU, Germany and the EIF. We're also supporting the Regional E-Commerce Strategy through DFAT's E-Commerce Aid for Trade Fund. And that'll help deliver cost-effective approaches to common regional e-commerce challenges, such as developing legislation on consumer protection, training for small business, and establishing arrangements between regional exporters and providers of e-commerce related services as a way to reduce unit costs. Now, I was asked to address specifically how Australia has pivoted our support to the region in the context of the economic impacts of COVID. And let's remind ourselves, Zarak touched on this, but just to remind ourselves, whilst the region has managed largely to avoid the worst health impacts of COVID-19 so far, although I have to pause there and say with the notable exception of the very serious outbreak occurring in Papua New Guinea right now, the way the Pacific has avoided COVID has come at significant economic cost, which is including collapse of revenue in some countries, foreign reserves and cash balances. It's an unprecedented economic impact from border closures. And as Zarak mentioned, it's especially devastating for many of the Pacific economies dependent on tourism as a source of jobs and government revenue. We anticipate that poverty and vulnerability will worsen with significant social consequences for the region. The ADB suggests that more than 1 million people in the region could fall into extreme poverty. In addition, we all know that climate change and weather-related events can exacerbate COVID-19 risks, and key economic recovery sectors such as tourism, agriculture and fisheries are particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts. So now more than ever, deeper regionalism is critical to help address these challenges and support economic recovery. Australia's response has been swift and significant and multifaceted to COVID. From a policy perspective, we have a new development policy called Partnerships for Recovery, and we've created new bilateral and a Pacific regional COVID-19 development response plan, setting out our COVID response and also aligned to continuing support to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. From a funding point of view, Australia is providing a record $1.44 billion in regular development assistance to the Pacific in 2021 to support recovery efforts. And all of our bilateral aid programs have been adjusted to meet new partner country needs and priorities. In terms of our overall operational response, I would say there have been 5 elements. First, in addition to the budget that I've just mentioned, we're providing a temporary targeted financing package of support through a $304.7 million COVID response package. And sorry, I should just clarify, all my dollar figures are Australian dollars. I haven't converted them to USD. The purpose of that package is to help Pacific mitigate fiscal crisis, maintain essential health and other services, protect the most vulnerable people, and re-establish and sustain air connectivity. Second, we've created a sustainable Pacific air connectivity program, which is so necessary to underpin current operations, but also to enable economic recovery and integration as conditions allow. There's a Pacific Flights program, funding for the Pacific Aviation Safety Office, and support to reduce inefficiencies in the aviation sector, so that the aviation sector is ready to go again when borders open. Third, and very importantly, we've throughout the crisis been supporting the movement of essential humanitarian and medical supplies, and to a lesser degree, sea and air freight through Australia to the Pacific, so that we've ensured a minimum level of connectivity, ability to move essential supplies, ability for economic freight to continue to operate. And all of that has been done under the guidance of the Pacific Islands Forum's humanitarian pathway. We've directly facilitated the delivery of more than 165,000 GeneXpert COVID testing cartridges and over 45 tonnes of humanitarian supplies in the last year. And we've supported the delivery of 211 tonnes of critical medical supplies during that period as well. Fourth, we've committed $200 million over 3 years to support safe and effective vaccine access in the Pacific, in 9 Pacific Island countries. And that'll be end-to-end support. We're not just delivering vaccines to the airport. We're involved in an end-to-end support to make sure that jabs get in arms, as it were, in a timely way. And we all know that how critical the vaccine rollout is going to be to the recovery.
Bill, my apologies for interrupting you. I know you're on your 5th and final point. If I can kindly request if you could wrap up in the next 30 seconds.
Okay, my 5th and final point is that regional labour mobility is a key element of our response. We're restarting labour mobility, and I think it's actually of growing importance in this time when the economies are suffering elsewise. We've mobilised more than 3,000 Pacific and Timorese workers since September last year, in addition to the approximately 8,500 redeployments of Pacific and Timorese workers. Zarak had some other very, very important points. Let me just quickly wrap up by saying it's very interesting and significant that the regional trade agreement PACER Plus has entered into force during the time of COVID. I have a feeling that maybe COVID helped get it over the line in many ways. We are actively going to be supporting the $25 million development work program funded as part of the whole PACER Plus agreement. It'll be driven by country needs assessments. And if we have the opportunity during Q&A to come back to the role of PACER Plus, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you very much.
Very much, Bill, for your extremely interesting insights and for that comprehensive presentation. Our thoughts and prayers are also with our friends and family in Papua New Guinea who are struggling at the moment in terms of containing COVID. I'm sure that hopefully it will come under control very soon. I am now going to go back to the Asian side of the world to connect with Mr. Noriaki Abe. Noriaki is Director for International Trade at the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs since November 2019. Since joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in 1997, he has been entrusted with responsibilities across a number of different areas, including in the 2nd North America Division, the Embassy in Washington, the Minister's Secretariat, the 1st Southeast Asia Division, the Policy Coordination Division, the Japan-US Security Treaty Division, and the Northeast Asia Division. Noriaki-san, Japan is one of the long-standing supporters of trade development in the Pacific region, and the country who first proposed the vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy has been underpinned by ambitious aid for trade interventions focusing on enhancing connectivity, including through trade-related infrastructure and trade facilitation. Noriaki-san, could you kindly elaborate on how this strategy is being approached in the Pacific with a view to supporting trade development in our developing country members? The floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you for your kind introduction, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to join you today. Allow me to start with introducing a photo behind me. This is my hometown Yaizu, located on the Pacific coast of Japan. This fishing town boasts one of the largest catches of tunas and bonitos in Asia, employs thousands of workers in food industries which are internationally competitive. It's well connected to the transportation networks home and abroad. It symbolizes openness, interdependence, connectivity, competition, and prosperity. However, there's a flip side. In 1954, a fishing boat was exposed to a radioactivity of nuclear test in the vicinity of Bikini Atoll. In essence, my hometown has been a testament of globalization even before the phrase was coined. Now, in the era of massive and endurable transportation and digitalization, the Pacific could never be smaller and the nations could never be closer. Against this background, literally, I'm speaking to you on the three transforming dimensions of Japan's policy orientation for aid for trade and infrastructure development. Let's look at the key statistics first. Who are our major trade partners? What are we trading? The following two slides eloquently portray the monocultural industrial structure and intra-regional as opposed to inter-regional trade patterns. These are perennial challenges that we must overcome with partners in and out of the region in a multilateral setting. In this respect, let's look at another set of numbers about the international engagement of this region. Out of the 16 countries, 8 have joined the WTO and 7 in the World Customs Organization, WCO. In the paradigm of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, not only the governments, but also multiple stakeholders in civil society have common objectives to achieve, interests to hold, and burdens to share. This is a compelling reason for us to remain committed to multilateral efforts and become even more open, inclusive, and integrated to the international cooperation. The more we engage in the multilateral cooperation, the more discipline and opportunities, such as becoming an integral part of the global value chain, would rise. So in this context, it is encouraging that Australia's Mr. Coleman is inaugurating as the OECD Secretary General. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is the first WTO Director General from the developing nation, and Japan sends Mr. Kunio Mikuriya to the Secretary General of WCO. Now, let me share with you the three dimensions of Japan's policy focus vis-a-vis aid for trade and infrastructure development. More emphasis is now placed on the quality. More resources are paid for people. More engagement is active in multilateral context. And time permitting, I'm going to make the case by taking a few examples. The first instance is what we call quality infrastructure. It came from Japan's own experience and collective analysis and multilateral discussions.
Noriaki-san, my apologies for interrupting you. Are your slides supposed to, are you moving on to the other slides? Unfortunately, it's not moving on the screen.
Oh, really? It shows the G20 principles.
No, we're still on the Pacific nations could not be closer.
I will check. Okay, hold on a second, please.
Is the slide moving?
No. No, it's not.
I see.
Perhaps, Noriaki-san, you can continue with the presentation and we'll change the
Yes.
slides from here at the Secretariat.
Good. I will. I'm now on the quality infrastructure. As you remember, the Osaka G20 summit 2 years ago, Japan proposed a set of principles that encapsulate all the essential recipes for strong, sustainable, and balanced economic and social growth. G20 principles pose practical guidelines, so to speak. For example, will the recipient government and taxpayers be able to pay back the debt on reasonable conditions? And is that particular port accessible to everyone, regardless of nationality, gender, and social status? Is management and governance functioning? The principles are not an abstract philosophy anymore, and it's being developed into more pragmatic standards and benchmarks And in this context, OECD propagates them by compiling the compendium of good practices and handbook. They are put on the web for every single stakeholder to use. Can you now see the slide now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So next slide, please. You may be familiar with those photos of airports and road under rehabilitation. JICA plays a pivotal role in putting these principles into practice through close consultations with local community municipalities, companies, financial institutions, and laborers. A wide range of stakeholders are involved in writing plans and implementing them for ensuring economic efficiency in view of life cycle cost, environmental impact, and resilience against natural disasters and other risks. Next slide, please. People-to-people exchange is another key to success. Japan has been active in hosting economic fora and dispatched business missions to foster long-standing relations and exchange expertise and experiences in the context of Pacific Islands Leaders Meeting, the abbreviation of which is PALM. Japan will host the PALM 9 this year, and I hope that it will give us another impetus to elevate our cooperation to business and trade facilitation onto higher sphere. And finally, the final slide demonstrates the significant potential of international cooperation in our region. At the end of the day, multilateralism is not a lofty and elusive context. It comes from a solid habit of cooperation and workable system participated by multiple stakeholders. Teaching the teachers is a path for sustainable development. And this particular context, Mr. Kunio Mikuriya has been leading the WCO for 13 years, and he has visited most of the island countries, both in the Pacific and the Caribbean. In order to assist capacity building in the areas of customs procedures and trade facilitation, the organization has held dozens of workshops, training sessions very actively in partnership with Japan's custom and local authorities. The Oceania Custom Organization is an indispensable equal partner to advance our common agenda. Japan continues to work shoulder to shoulder with practitioners and other stakeholders. This concludes my 6-minute presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Noriaki-san, for elaborating on such a topical issue and on its implications for the Pacific region. Ladies and gentlemen, with these insights in mind, let me now move back to Fiji, and in particular to Dr. Arya Askola. Arya is currently the Deputy Head of the European Union's Delegation for the Pacific. She has extensive experience in the EU's trade and development relations with African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of states. Before her diplomatic career, she worked in the Trade Department of the European Commission in Brussels, where she worked on economic partnership agreements and aid for trade. Dear Arya, in December 2020, negotiators reached a political deal on a new EU, Africa, Caribbean, Pacific Partnership Agreement. Could you elaborate for us on the implications that this new partnership will produce in the area of trade development for the Pacific? And how will the new partnership affect the formulation and delivery of regional aid for trade programs compared to the current European Development Fund framework? Please go ahead, Arya, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Zarak. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me to this virtual event. Yes, let me go directly to the business. By way of introduction, I just wanted to explain a little bit what the EU-ACP relations are all about. Because the EU has a long history of partnership with African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of states, the ACP. When these countries gained independence, a special ACP-EU trade regime ensured that they could continue to trade freely with the European member states that were then in the European Economic Community. This regime was, however, contested in the WTO, which found that it discriminated against other WTO members, in particular other developing countries. So this specific trade regime was therefore replaced by WTO compatible economic partnership agreements in the currently applicable Cotonou Partnership Agreement. So EPAs are reciprocal, but they are asymmetric in favor of ACP countries to take into account the different level of development of the partners. They are not obligatory, but they are the only way for non-LDC partner countries to maintain full free access to the EU market. 4 Pacific countries so far have opted for this type of agreement: Fiji, PNG, Samoa and Solomon Islands, and we are expecting more countries to join in the years to come. The Cotonou Agreement will be replaced by a new ACP-EU framework agreement, normally by the end of this year. The post-Cotonou Agreement, as we call it, contains a specific protocol for the Pacific region, and this protocol includes a chapter for trade cooperation. The parties have agreed a number of key areas for future cooperation, but there is no financial protocol as such attached to this protocol or to this agreement. There is cooperation, and cooperation is not it's not limited to development cooperation only. It can be also different forms of cooperation. The text is not yet publicly available, and so I cannot really go into details and the contents, but let me just make a couple of general points on the trade instruments, and then on the aid for trade, as this is the specific subject matter for us today. First of all, there will be no change in the available trade instruments. The economic partnership agreements will stay there. They will remain available for ACP countries. And then the unilateral generalized scheme of preferences will remain available in the same terms as for other developing countries at the same level of development. So this means that the EU market will remain open for Pacific exports in the same terms as currently. So meaning that 8 countries out of 15, so half of the 15 Pacific ACP countries will continue to export all their products into the EU without any tariffs or quotas. And once the LDCs graduate from the category, and they are currently Kiribati, Timor-Leste, Tuvalu and Vanuatu, they can join the existing IPA if they so wish. Secondly, on the aid for trade, the post-Cotonou agreement does not really affect the formulation and delivery of regional aid for trade programs as such. This is more related to the new instrument to finance EU external action. It's called Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, so-called NDICI. Unlike the current EU European Development Fund that we are applying here in the Pacific region, it's a global instrument, but it will have specific envelopes for different regions. But the financial allocations for different regions are not yet determined. We are at the early stages of programming, starting consultations with our partners to establish priorities. It's still too early to say how it will affect future formulation of regional programs, but we normally apply the principle of subsidiarity. So we want to take action at the level where it can be the most effective and have most impact. We want to strengthen our bilateral partnerships and define programs that can best deliver on our partner countries' development needs. So it's clear the EU believes that trade is key for transforming the economy, and aid for trade and trade agreements will help make this happen. The EU and its member states together provide 1/3 of all the aid for trade worldwide. It's currently, or in the last reporting period, 2018, it was 13.5 billion euros worldwide. The bulk of this goes to Africa, but the Pacific is getting its share as well. There are several projects and programs ongoing to implement also the Pacific Aid for Trade strategy. the current Pacific Regional Integration Support Program is worth 37 million euros, and it's a good example of how we support regional integration in this region, trade facilitation, regulatory harmonization.
My apologies, Aria. If I can ask you to wrap up in 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. So just in general on the different projects that we have or programs that we have several in the pipeline, indeed on trade facilitation in the agricultural sector. We are improving customs processes here, private sector development initiative, you know, we will do our best to deliver on these programs together with the regional partners that we have, but then also at country level. So we will be acting where we can have most impact and more at country level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aria, for your enlightening presentation and contributing to our discussion. Let us now move to Aotearoa, New Zealand, where Mr. Desmond Topangaya is waiting for us, and he's temporarily based in Samoa at the moment on assignment. Desmond is the unit manager for People, Trade and Culture within the Pacific Regional Division of the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Desmond started with the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade back in January 2019, after working across a number of New Zealand government agencies, including the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Justice, and the Housing New Zealand Corporation. Desmond, as I understand, approximately 30% of New Zealand's total aid for trade funding can be tagged as aid for trade. Can you please enlighten for us and outline how New Zealand's approach or strategy for aid for trade is for the Pacific, including how it seeks to address regional trade challenges and how COVID-19 has impacted on New Zealand's prioritization of aid for trade? You have 6 minutes, Desmond.
Thank you, Zarak. Just want to acknowledge the fellow panelists who are part of this event this morning. Just want to acknowledge PIF and the work they've done to pull this work together. And also want to acknowledge the people who have joined in to listen to this particular event today as part of the Aid for Trade Stocktake run by the World Trade Organization. I wanted to cover off a bit of the context of the Pacific and how it operates, and fortunately Bill did that really well. So I'm going to drill into a couple of the elements of that Bill talked about. One is about remote populations. So I just want to touch on that in terms of really highlighting how unique and difficult that can be within the Pacific. If I take the example of Tokelau, Tokelau is a state where, in order to get there, you have to first get to Samoa. So you have to organize flights and travel to Samoa, and then you have to spend 1.5 days on a boat in order to get to the island of Tokelau, in order to transact business, work within that country, get specialists over there to help development programs. So just trying to acknowledge the remoteness of the Pacific and working within that space. The other point that I wanted to talk about was the impact that climate change has on the Pacific. So the Pacific feels it more than most. If I think about Fiji in particular, in December it had Cyclone Yasa. In January or February it had Cyclone Ana. And in April of 2020, I think it also had Cyclone Harold. So within the space of less than 12 months, it suffered 3 cyclones or endured 3 cyclones. So just wanting to kind of really highlight the impact that climate change has acutely within the Pacific and in that space. So within that context, New Zealand and how we operate within the Pacific is changed significantly. How we engage is really important within the New Zealand context. So maybe in 2018, we started the journey of the Pacific Reset. The Pacific Reset kind of emphasized how we were going to engage within the community, within the Pacific, and with our partner governments. And it basically had 5 principles that underpinned it. It talked about mutual understanding, a mutual benefit, a friendship in our relationship, a collective impact and sustainability. So bringing to that as part of our relationship management within the Pacific and how we work with our partners really underpins the work that we do. And as a result of that in-depth relationship that we have with our partners, we feel like we're shifting more away from a donor-recipient type relationship to one of a true partnership, where we share and understand the problems that our partners are trying to address, and we work together to see how we can best do that. I think that kind of shifts towards the regional trade challenges that we face in the region. So the ideas of exporter readiness, legislative compliance, supply chains, air versus sea, all those types of challenges and barriers that make trading within the Pacific quite difficult. So what's New Zealand doing in that space? We have a number of different ways that we try to work within the space. If I think about PACER Plus as an example, hand in glove with Australia as part of that work. A lot of our work is hand in glove with Australia. We share really common interests in the Pacific and work really well together to deliver some really good outcomes. So PACER Plus, labour mobility, really strong pieces of architecture that we're developing and continue to deliver within the region. I think about the PTI network that comes under the PIF. So we support the New Zealand version of the PTI network, and that provides another mechanism through which we can build up the capacity of exporters and importers across the region to trade across the region. I think about some of our bilateral work. So at the moment, being in Samoa, we have a private sector development program that we're implemented here. We have some more tourism work that we've implemented as well. So tourism, like most of the Pacific, suffered quite significantly as a result of COVID. And so what we've been working with the Samoan Tourism Authority around is how do we support the industry, continue to let the industry prepare itself for when borders open and tourism resumes. So we've been working quite closely with the Samoa Tourism Authority to develop activities that can help support that. They've been exploring the types of activities they've been exploring include contact tracing options and market readiness in terms of their tourism and hotel industry. So I want to touch on COVID and the impact that that's had and how New Zealand's responded as part of that process. So in terms of New Zealand, I guess the key priority for New Zealand's response has been around the health impact and health response for the region. So we transitioned from providing significant support when COVID commenced, some significant support in terms of PPE equipment and expertise to the region, and working through the PHP and PIF through that as well as part of that process. We've also worked starting to transition to vaccines and how we can support the Pacific in terms of vaccinations and therefore resuming business as a result of being able to open borders. So another
my apologies, Desmond, for interrupting you. If you can finish in 30 seconds, please.
Yeah. So just drawing that to a conclusion is we will continue to support a COVID response, and we are looking forward to, I guess, the free and open ability to travel, and therefore for economies to rebuild back better, stronger, more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Desmond, for your presentation and highlighting New Zealand's priorities and perspectives on aid for trade and the good work that you're doing on supporting our member states on COVID-19 recovery. Now, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, after hearing from our donor partners, we're now keen to elicit their experiences from our member states. The replication of successful national initiatives is an important channel to devise regional successful solutions. And I believe Vanuatu in particular can provide very useful insights on this approach. I'm therefore very pleased to introduce Mr. Stanley Treef, from Port Vila. Stanley is the manager for the Vanuatu Single Window Project since 2019. Before leading the Single Window team, Stanley led the transition of the Asakuda system to the world version and served in the Vanuatu Customs Department for more than 10 years, with responsibilities ranging from ICT systems to border controls. Stanley has conducted Asakuda and customs modernization assessments in most Pacific countries. Dear Stanley, in the area of trade facilitation, the electronic single window of Vanuatu is seen as one of the regional success stories. Would you be able to share with us your experience from this project, its results, the main lessons learned, including in the context of COVID-19, as well as your views about the conditions and the potential for a successful regional uptake of Vanuatu's model? Stanley, the floor is yours and you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, moderator. A very good evening to you and good morning to our audience, wherever they're watching from. Good morning. Allow me first to thank the Pacific Islands Forum and the FED for giving Vanuatu the opportunity to share in this Aid for Trade session some real-life experience of our efforts to facilitate trade in Vanuatu by implementing an electronic single window system, and how we see the possibility of replicating that to the region. In 2014, a single window assessment was conducted in Vanuatu to consider options to facilitate trade. The assessment identified that all the agencies responsible to regulate the movement of goods across our borders do not have an automated system. As the first step towards achieving an electronic single window system, the assessment recommended for Vanuatu to upgrade its customs Asakuda++ system to the modernized version of Asakuda World. The assessment further made the recommendation for Vanuatu to consider using Asakuda World as its single automated system to be used by all the regulatory agencies. The recommendation was approved and endorsed by our National Trade Development Committee. The Vanuatu government therefore made the commitment to fund the $1 million upgrade to Asakuda World. This project was considered as the first phase of the Vanuatu Electronic Single Window Project and was successfully completed in 2018. Following this commitment by the Vanuatu government, we looked for support from the donor community to assist with the second phase of the project, which is to automate the other regulatory agencies. And thanks to the generous support of the Enhanced Integrated Framework, or EIF, in Australia, and the technical assistance from the Geneva Peace or Pacific Island Forum Secretariat Office, Vanuatu was able to secure the resources for this much anticipated phase of the project. During the inception of the Single Window Project in early 2019, it was identified that biosecurity would be the first agency to be automated due to its high level of intervention against the volume of trade. Biosecurity was one of the identified agencies that has never had an automated system, meaning the application and processing of permits and certificates, the clearance of goods have always been done manually and in a paper-based environment. With the automation of biosecurity now in the single window system, permits and certificates are now processed online in Vanuatu for the first time ever. The application process average time went from days to as little as 10 minutes. This online development went live in Vanuatu on 24th of March, 2020, which is exactly a year ago today. Just as Vanuatu went on the lockdown due to the global pandemic. Having biosecurity using the Asakuda system meant that this border agency can now train customs to also have online access to cargo manifest and cargo clearance, rather than on paper like they used to in the past. Cargo clearance is therefore submitted once by the traders into the system with automatic verification of the biosecurity permits and certificates before clearance can be processed electronically by both agencies. This process has now become more efficient and transparent with increased data integrity in real time. This level of transformation from manual processing to digital with little to no physical human interaction is obviously very economical to the traders, with huge savings in processing time and over 85% reduction on paper usage and over 67% reduction in physical trips made to biosecurity offices, and therefore reducing your fuel consumptions. And we believe that these innovations will have direct impact on our economy and on our environment. I must say that it is a challenge convincing an agency to be involved in a modernization project, which is understandable if the agency has had no past experience with automation and therefore would not be able to comprehend how the introduction of a system will affect the processes. And furthermore, automation may not have been a priority for the agency. To overcome such challenges, we made sure in Vanuatu that the single window project has a good governance structure, as well as dynamic public relations. We also made sure that there is good communication and engagement with the agency concerned to ensure ownership and commitment. And I would strongly recommend such approaches to ensure successful outcome of any modernization project. Now, of course, biosecurity and customs are not the only agencies involved with the movement of goods across our borders. The automation of the other identified agencies would greatly assist with the facilitation of trade in Vanuatu, and subsequently, we can replicate that to other countries in the region, even by using the developed capacity we now have in Vanuatu. I personally, as you mentioned in the introduction, I have been involved in such regional experience in the past by conducting other customs reform assessments to most of the Pacific Island countries. To conclude, I think the work done in these areas of automation in Vanuatu clearly demonstrates how genuine commitment by the donors and the implementing partners to work together to put the beneficiary in the driving seat, which can deliver lasting results for a country, and how successful national projects in such specific areas like our electronic single window can create opportunities for replication and for practical regionalism through a bottom-up approach. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Stanley. Your presentation has truly added value to our discussion today. I'm now happy to move to Mary Elizabeth Ramosaya, who is connected with us from the Solomon Islands. Mary Elizabeth is the founder and the business director of Kaleko Stay-Free Solomons. The company specializes in producing and distributing an environmental-oriented reusable pad for women and girls, this supporting their empowerment through social entrepreneurship. But the trade venture of Elizabeth needs to be economically sustainable for gender empowerment to be far-reaching and long-lasting. And this is where Aid for Trade can help. Mary Elizabeth, the economic impact of COVID-19 in the Pacific region has been significant and continues to unfold. Women in particular have been hard hit, and therefore the work of social enterprises such as yours remains very critical. What have been the main practical challenges your enterprise has faced, and how has the support your enterprise has been able to access through an innovative trade finance mechanism such as the Trade Finance Vehicle been a game changer on the impact of your work, including in terms of improving social and economic outcomes for women in the Solomon Islands? Mary Elizabeth, I hand over to you for 6 minutes.
And panelists, I hope you can hear me clearly from your end. First of all, I would like to say thank you to the organizers and PIFs for having me on this panel. It's a real honor and a privilege to share the work of Kaleko Stay-Free in the Solomons. I would like to share my PowerPoint here, but unfortunately, given that I'm only have 6 minutes, I'm planning to just talk. I would like to set some context about Calico Stay Free. Calico Stay Free is a package of values represented by its product and services to empower women in Solomon Islands to reach its full potential. The social enterprise focuses its efforts on producing and distributing reusable sanitary pads for women and girls in schools and the wider community in Solomon Islands. And it also places a huge emphasis or importance on education, especially on menstrual health and hygiene. Calico Stay Free also propagates the idea that behavioral change can lead to an increased positive development for Solomon Islands. And I can safe to assume that even in the Pacific, particularly for women and girls. And as a result, we believe that women can be identified as effective contributors to a local economy. So how does Calico Stay Free able to build its resilience and sustain its production throughout the COVID situation? We are happy to say that it is through the support of the Trade Finance Vehicle, or TFV for short. What is a trade finance vehicle? The Menstrual Health Enterprise Trade Finance Vehicle is a unique financing vehicle that helps menstrual health enterprises like ours, like Calico Stay Free, to address the financing and supply chain challenges in the countries of the Pacific, and especially with the dispersed population that we have across large geographical locations within the Pacific. And so therefore, there is limited income and commercial access. And in this regard, Calico Stay Free as Solomon's as a case in point. How does the TFV implementation process works for us? The trade finance vehicle through the Pacific Rise was administered and implemented through an intermediary called Red Hat Impact and Lotus Impact. The Red Hat Impact work closely with social enterprises to understand their needs in terms of financing, and then finalize a contract with a payment schedule upon both party agreement. And then the Red Hat Impact then facilitate the process from the sellers in China, and then it flows through Brisbane and arrived in at the destination, which is in PNG, here in Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and also Samoa. Red Hat Impact also works through identified customs broker and then delivered those fabrics to our production center. So that's how the implementation process works for us. Now, the impact of the trade finance vehicle, or TFV, on Calico Stay Free, it creates a new opportunity for Calico Stay Free to increase its production capacity. And in so doing, during the COVID-19 period, due to travel ban, we've experienced the minimal production of reusable pads due to lack of fabrics and materials. And so what the trade finance vehicle does for us, it removes barriers such as suitcase trade allowing us to have bulk orders. And it also, I think overally, it mitigate the supply chain challenge that social enterprises like ours face. And it also make capital available through these financing vehicle and connecting us to intermediaries such as the Red Hat Impact to help us work through the process and also understand how the scheduled payment works for us. So overall, it facilitates payment transactions from seller to buyer through a supply contract. And the result is we're able to scale up in production and to meet the demand here in country. So this is a huge step away from the production capacity we have had since we started Calico Stay Free in 2017 to 2019. Now, the TFV has really helped us with ongoing efforts to impact our communities. And through this process, we were able to develop our resilience through networking with the support from important players within the trade finance process, such as DFAD, Pacific Rise, and others. And we are here as long as we have a purpose to fulfill in the Solomon Islands and the Pacific region. And trade has played a huge role in making it possible for us to fulfill that mandate. So how does trade, the TFV improve social and economic outcome for women in Solomon Islands? In my experience, it creates jobs for women, women with disability and even young people. It helps us to work with our partner organizations such as World Vision, Live and Learn Plan International, just to name a few, to run their WASH programs in country. And therefore, we're able to distribute reusable sanitary pads to girls in school. And in doing that, it also helped address the absenteeism in classes during a girls' period experience. And also it helps to provide supportive information. And therefore, girls are able to access healthy sanitary products, and also information is improved within the country. In conclusion, to conclude, despite the impact of COVID-19 on Calico Stay Free Solomons in 2020, with the implication it has on our production level versus increased demand from sanitary reusable pads in the domestic market, we have received full support through the trade finance vehicle. And we're happy to say that we are fully implementing it in 2021. Materials were received in the beginning of March 2021. About more than 3,000 reusable sanitary pads will be produced. Therefore, more than 3,000 girls will receive reusable pads for this year. That being said, Tagio Tumas, and thank you.
Mary Elizabeth, I think on behalf of everyone, we congratulate you for your innovative business, a good example of social entrepreneurship that is having a very big impact on the lives of women and girls in Solomon Islands. Thank you very much for your presentation. It yet again shows a different angle of aid for trade and how it is having a grassroots impact in improving the lives of Pacific Islanders around the region. So ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, that brings us to an end for the presentations from the 7 panelists who had joined us today. They will stay online. We are now moving to the question and answer session, and we have had a few questions that have been posed through the Q&A tab that is on the Zoom platform. For those that still have questions and have not submitted them, we encourage you to do so. So to the first question, we have had 2 questions being posed to Mr. Bill Costello from DFAT. The question comes in 2 parts, Bill. So we'll give you 2 minutes to respond in total to these 2 questions. The first question is, what do you think could be done to encourage Papua New Guinea and Fiji to join PESA Plus and enhance regional cooperation on issues such as combating COVID-19? And the second part of the question is, could you please elaborate on the significance of trade supplies that you mentioned at the end of your presentation? I believe you had gone through 5 priorities that DFAT is implementing in the Pacific region. So Bill, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Zarak. On the question of PESA Plus and Papua New Guinea and Fiji coming on board, I guess what I would say is I hope that when we're all old and grey and we look back in 20 years, we'll say that this was just such a small beginning, but it grew into something very large and very significant. I think what we will be aiming to do collectively, and I acknowledge Desmond's comments about the importance of our work with New Zealand, but also I think we're the first task is to meet the needs of the Pacific Island countries who are members of the agreement. And we're doing refreshing the needs assessments country by country and making sure that the development assistance that we provide under PESA Plus really meets what they prioritise. And therefore, there's the value of PESA Plus is demonstrated from the point of view of the island countries. I think the other thing that we can do over time is have a strategy to broaden out the countries that are become parties to the agreement within the Pacific and beyond the Pacific. And I would love to see some of the major developed country partners for the Pacific come on board for PESA Plus over time as well. So I think the short answer is we're just going to have to demonstrate its value and then hope that Fiji and Papua New Guinea see the example and go forward from there. I'm not so sure about the second question, but what I will say is a bit linked to what I just said. The great value of PACER Plus is that it's not a traditional trade agreement. It's a trade and development agreement. And we not only want to support Pacific trade, but support all the underpinnings that will allow that to happen. And this is where the Development Assistance Program, managed through a PACER Plus implementation unit, will be so very important. So, and it's things like supporting customs processes, which our colleague from Vanuatu talked about, but it's also things like the very practical support for entrepreneurship that our colleague from the Solomon Islands talked about. All of that is part of the total effort that I hope will say that, as you know, as I said, in 10 or 20 years from now, we'll look back and say we were there at the beginning of something very significant. Thanks.
Very much. Thank you very much, Bill, for that response. The second question is directed to Ms. Jenna Diallo from the United States. Jenna, the United States Indo-Pacific strategy includes a commitment to promote regional economic integration, including through the harmonization of trade disciplines in the areas of customs, trade facilitation, and standards. Similar commitments are also included in the Pacific Aid for Trade strategy, indicating that there is room to develop regional aid for trade programs. What type of regional aid for trade activities could be activated to support regional economic integration by the United States?
Thank you for the question. So Usaid is currently providing, there's a couple of things we're currently doing and then a couple of new programs we have coming up online. Currently, we have been providing some trade capacity building assistance to Papua New Guinea that was based on a request. So we have been able to respond to specific requests on trade capacity building. We conducted last year a training on trade negotiations for a wide range of stakeholders in the ministries, departments, and agencies. And we're actually getting ready to plan a second broader training. In addition, we have a program in the Solomon Islands called the Strengthening Competitiveness, Agriculture, Livelihoods, and Environment Program. And as a part of that program, we have a couple of assessments that will be happening shortly. One is doing an assessment for a legal and regulatory process diagnostic for cross-border trade. And another is a trade facilitation standards and practices assessment. And then additionally, we have a competition policy, legal and institutional gap analysis that will be done. So we'll be providing targeted support for Solomon Islands on that. In addition, we have two new programs that will expand further our work in economic growth in general and in trade as well. One is a program called the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership Activity. We just put out a request for information a few weeks ago. Through this activity, which is regional in nature, there may be some opportunity to also do bilateral work as well, but we're aiming to foster an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure digital ecosystem in the Pacific Islands. And I believe, as I mentioned before, obviously there will be some impact and relevance for trade work as well in that. It will look at the legal and regulatory environment to support digital economy and hopefully mobilize public and private investment into the ICT sector and look at things like regulatory reforms on market liberalization, deregulation, and expanding broadband internet access. The second program we still have is under design, and we've already begun consulting with donors on a program called the Pacific Economic Growth Support Activity, which we're hoping to launch in the next year, which seeks to promote higher levels of trade investment by strengthening countries' capacity on public financial management, as well as improving the enabling environment and lowering the cost of doing business, and expanding participation of private enterprise and supporting local entrepreneurship. So we really see this as an opportune time to be hearing from organizations like PIFs and the other donors on how we can tailor that support under the economic growth activity to support some of these ongoing regional efforts on trade facilitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenna, for that comprehensive response. The next question that is directed to Mr. Noriaki-san from Japan. Noriaki, regional cooperation can efficiently support productivity whenever the limited size of our members makes it suboptimal to act nationally. For examples that were highlighted earlier, in the area of international standards and conformity assessments, the establishment of regional mechanisms for testing, certification, and accreditation can overcome national capacity constraints. Noriaki, what is your view about the potential of regional trade-related assistance in the Pacific, including in the light of Japan's experience in other regions of the Indo-Pacific, such as ASEAN?
Well, thank you for asking for the very interesting question. I'm very tempted to say, why not? But on the second thought, I would be rather cautious for the following reasons. First, well, our experience in Asian countries are so different, maybe too different from those in Pacific island countries. So it may not be effective to apply our experience in the legal assistance or formulating a regional legal framework for those countries. So this is the first reason. And second reason, as I mentioned, international efforts are ongoing on one hand, so it would not be cost effective to come up with a regionally peculiar legal system or mechanism. And the third reason is quite simple. Originality can be an enemy in light of consistency with international rules and standards. As you may see, I'm playing the role of the devil's advocate for this question, but let it put this in the whole consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noriaki-san, for that comprehensive feedback on that question. The next question that we have is for Area from the European Union delegation here in Suva. Area, trade integration lies at the heart of EU's development strategy that you had mentioned and helps in explaining its continuous support for regional aid for trade programs. The Forum Secretariat and other regional agencies have long benefited from such programs supported by the European Union. From your point of view, what are the main lessons from past regional assistance in the area of trade? And how can these lessons inform the development of future regional aid for trade programs that the EU has planned for the Pacific region?
Thank you for this question. Well, I would say that from my experience with different ACP partners in different ACP regions, I would say that in general, the challenge has been to mobilize funding from regional programs for actions at country level. And as I mentioned before, country level is where the most of the impact can be achieved, and that's why this has been a bit of a, I would say, difficult at times when we have been trying to implement, for instance, a bilateral trade agreement and getting support for those needs, sometimes very small needs. I think we need to assess very carefully how any action that we can take at regional level will deliver on the development needs of the partner countries, because this is what our aim is. For instance, where reforms need to be undertaken at country level and domestic policies improved, one needs to look at the concrete added value that regional organizations can bring, for instance, in orchestrating policy dialogues and playing the role of a convener, as we are doing today. So I think we really need to assess the prospects of any specific action to produce concrete impacts at country level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uria, for your response. That's very much appreciated. We have an audience question for Vanuatu to Stanley. Stanley, this question is for you. Now that Vanuatu single window has been implemented, how can customs collaborate to facilitate trade for MSMEs further through the global postal network, responsible for some 70% of cross-border e-commerce parcels up to 2 kilograms?
Thank you, Zarak, and thank you for the question. I am pleased to say that, and just briefly, with the support from Japan and EIF, we will be implementing an electronic interface between the postal system and Asegura, with our assistance from our implementing partner, UNTAD and UPU, to interface the two systems. And currently, this process is of dealing with postal goods is all done manually, so you can just imagine the complications and delays involved with the movement of postal goods. So we are anticipating that with this interface, the agencies, customs and biosecurity can conduct the checks electronically in the system while collecting data. And while doing so, they would be able to facilitate the movement of small parcels, which we see would be beneficial for e-commerce and for our SMEs. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Stanley, for your response to that question. I'm going to now move on to Desmond from New Zealand. There's a question from the audience, Desmond, in relation to trade and climate change. We note that New Zealand last year has recently proposed a trade arrangement with a number of countries, I believe, including Fiji, is in current negotiations with New Zealand and other partners for. From your perspective, how important is the issue of ensuring the climate change matter is taken into account when you're negotiating trade arrangements, but also broadly, how can trade policy better account for the issue of climate change in general?
Thanks for the question, Zarak. So in terms of climate change, it's an integral part of our policy development and in our trade policy development. So as I mentioned, the Pacific is subject to the impacts of climate change more than most, and New Zealand recognises that as being in and of the Pacific. And as a result of that, it's one of our key policy portfolios that the government is endorsing and actively pursuing and progressing within our work. So in terms of the trade work for the Pacific and the region, our PACER Plus work and the work that we will support and deliver under that will be informed by our understanding of climate change and how we can incorporate those policy decisions as part of the development of those packages and those work programs. It underpins, it's a cross-cutting issue that underpins all our policy work. So whenever we're thinking about labour mobility, the impacts of labour mobility and what impact climate change might have in that space in terms of our exports and industry, what's the impact that climate change might have in that work and that space. And so being mindful and accounting for that as part of all of our thinking and work in terms of economic development within New Zealand, and also carrying that through in terms of our relationships with our Pacific partners and how we can ensure and reflect that in the work that we do jointly together.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Desmond, for your response. I'm going to jump back to Bill Costello, Mr. Bill Costello from DFAT. There is a question from the audience, Bill, regarding labour mobility. I'll try and summarize the question. Essentially, what the audience member is asking is that due to the labour mobility schemes that New Zealand and Australia has, namely the RSC, the Seasonal Worker Program, and now the Pacific Labour Scheme. From the perspective of this audience member, there's an obvious drain on young, motivated workers and semi-skilled workers who are now going to Australia to work on farms and other sectors that have been opened up. Has Australia or New Zealand, and in this case Australia, done any research when it comes to the impact which the labour mobility schemes are having in terms of having workforce available back in the Pacific Island countries to populate their respective sectors?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Just starting with the research, yes, that we fund a research program around our labour mobility. I'd invite people to look at some of the publications of the World Bank in this space, which we support, but also the Development Policy Centre at the Australian National University. But I will say in some areas, the jury is out and there are a number of questions about impact. Our overall observations are that while the risk that has been described by the questioner probably exists, perhaps if we're anywhere near that risk of sort of overdoing the brain drain, it might be Vanuatu, perhaps Tonga, but certainly countries like Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, there's still a huge reservoir, if you like, of young workers who are looking for opportunity. And these labour mobility schemes are providing opportunity, but they're also providing skills, knowledge, experience. And we do find that in addition to the income that's earned, which is often used back in home countries to build the family a house, put the kids through school, meet essential health costs and so forth, we are positive that there is a spin-off in terms of entrepreneurship, people starting businesses, people applying some of the technologies and techniques they've learned in Australia to their own farming enterprises and so forth. So there's definitely a brain gain, which I hope is significantly outweighing the brain drain. But I realise we will have to be attentive to the brain drain, but our assumption at the moment is that the risk is all on the upside. We want to do more, not less of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Appreciate your candid feedback on that question. The next question is for Ms. Mary Elizabeth from the Solomon Islands. Mary, I think recently we had International Women's Day, and the theme for that was choose to challenge. And I think you're certainly doing that when it comes to your specific business. I think when it comes to entrepreneurship, it's a challenge for any young person, and certainly a woman trying to break that glass ceiling. Could you perhaps maybe share your perspectives with our audience in terms of how you were able to address issues when it came to starting your business, but certainly trying to expand your business? I think you talked briefly about the trade finance vehicle, and obviously access to finance still remains a very big challenge for the Pacific region, and Aid for Trade can play an important role in that. We have development partners here around the table. What would be your message to them and your plea to them?
Thank you. I think first and foremost, I would say it's all about understanding one's purpose. And I have a strong passion for what I'm doing. And in that, recognizing those who are also part of making sure that this purpose comes to fruition is important. And that being said, it also helps to build the kind of resilience that I've experienced as an entrepreneur or a young entrepreneur in the Pacific. And I think one of the statements that I obviously put out was that women in the Pacific, they do have a strong resilience during times of crisis. And with all the process and the experience that we had, I think it really showcased that kind of resilience. And so one of the things that I wanted to say to those who are here listening today, tonight, is morning, is that please, however you can, especially for this is an opportunity where our women can rise to the challenge, especially when it comes to this whole COVID situation. I believe every single woman in the Pacific, they do have the potential to do what's best to take care of their families, the communities, and their society, however they can. I hope I'm answering your question. Thank you.
Mary Elizabeth, sincerely appreciate your response and feedback to the question, which I'm sure will inspire a lot of people around the region. We have one final question that we have time for, and I think there's been a lot of interest generated by this Aid for Trade event on the PESA Plus agreement in particular. We have a question from Solomon Islands, an audience member, and so perhaps maybe I can direct this once again either to Desmond or to Bill Costello. Either one of you, please, you're welcome to answer this. The question is that PESA Plus entry into force has been welcomed by this delegate. How much focus will be given to the private sector in the implementation and the disbursement of the 25 million Australian dollars development funding that is provided for under the agreement? Perhaps maybe we can give you a minute each. Maybe Desmond first and then Bill Costello.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Zarak. So I guess from my perspective, Bill talked about the needs analysis that was being undertaken with the signatories, and that's about identifying from the signatories what it is they need in terms of the development assistance that's available. So we're really looking to see and understand what it is that our partners want and need from the development assistance, and use that as part of the prioritization process about how the funding will be divided and allocated across different parts of need. So I guess it's member driven, and that'll be how we approach that piece of division of that fund available for those partners to use to develop their systems and processes. Thanks.
Thanks, Desmond. Bill, would you like to have a minute on this one?
Yes, thank you. And fully endorsing what Desmond has just said about the demand-driven nature of the assistance. So the obvious thing to say is that it's going to be the private sector that does the trading, not governments largely. So of course they need to benefit from this assistance, and I think they'll benefit directly in some cases through capacity building programs and so forth. Not through, not through finance for their business. That's not the role of a trade agreement. But yes, we want to build their capacity. We want to build their awareness. E-commerce has been talked about a few times tonight. Very important for the Pacific. So we hope there'll be a lot of focus there. Some of the other assistance will be more for the enabling environment, which will tend to be more for government agencies, but with the purpose of supporting the private sector to trade. The other thing I would say is that it's not just about the PESA Plus assistance. There's a whole range of private sector development activities out there in the region. Mary Elizabeth talked about some that she's benefited from. There's a Farmer Plus, which is very active in the agriculture sector, the Market Development Facility. We support the activities of the International Finance Corporation, the Asian Development and Private Sector Development Initiative. So actually PESA Plus is part of the architecture, but there's a whole lot of other activity that wraps around PESA Plus. And in many ways, what PESA Plus hopefully will do will magnify and increase the ability of those other private sector development activities to have really positive benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill and Desmond. Just in the spirit of talking about the private sector, there was one last question that came in relation to the role of the Pacific Islands Private Sector Organization in terms of their support for regionalism, and how can they be better supported to ensure that they can deliver on their role. And I think this question was directed to the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, so I'm happy to take that. I think for those delegates who are not aware, the Pacific Islands Private Sector Organization is the regional body in the Pacific that represents the private sector from the region. They were a creation of the decision of Pacific Islands Forum Economic Ministers back around 20 years ago. And so it is an important institution. The membership comprises the national chambers of commerce in each of our Pacific Island countries. We're also happy to announce that very recently, we recruited our program officer, private sector development, who is the former CEO for PIPSO. And so through the help of Ms. Alisi Tunga, we're hoping that we can strengthen the Pacific Islands Private Sector Organization, work with our development partners, some of whom are around the table today, to ensure that PIPSO receives the funding support that it needs to ensure that it can better deliver on its role. We also have something called the Private Sector Dialogue that is held on the margins of the Forum Economic Ministers meeting, which is our annual finance ministers meeting here in the Pacific. and also on the margins of the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Meeting. And so these engagement platforms provide a very important voice for the private sector in the region to articulate their concerns to our ministers and our leaders in the region, so that these are able to be taken into account and we are able to come up with regional policies to try and address them. So I hope that responds to the question from a colleague from the Solomon Islands who had posed that question about PIPSO. So colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's now time to bring our session to a close. And in light of today's discussion, I think we can all agree that regional approaches are central to promoting and sustaining trade development in the Pacific. I think you'll all agree that today's session has also confirmed that these approaches can take different forms, ranging from voluntary coordination to the more binding forms of regional integration enshrined in regional trade agreements. There is a clear case for bringing the variety of these forms under the umbrella of overarching regional initiatives, trying to align the different actors working on aid for trade in the Pacific, from donor partners to international and regional organizations, non-state actors, and member states. It is my belief that through coordinated regional initiatives, practical convergences can be found between the different approaches of multiple partners so as to maximize the benefits for our region. This is the very reason why the Pacific Islands Forum is investing much of its energy in promoting and coordinating regional initiatives in the priority areas identified by the Pacific Aid for Trade strategy. Many of our partners have already shown significant commitment to the Pacific regionalism, and I believe your presence today is testament to the fact that our regional aid for trade agenda will continue to grow from strength to strength. Consultations on the Pacific Aid for Trade strategy started on the occasion of the 2017 Aid for Trade Global Review. The new strategy was presented at the 2019 Global Review, and today has been an important occasion to mobilize our partners around its priorities. The Secretariat will continue to use the global platform provided by the WTO to support Pacific regionalism. And I propose to meet again on the occasion of the Global Review to take stock on our collective progress in 2022. With that, I wish to sincerely thank all our distinguished panelists for their active participation today, as well as the WTO Secretariat to enable this event. A special word of thanks goes to the Government of Australia as one of our most trusted partners and the co-organizer of this event. I'd like to also thank the audience that had posed the questions that were responded to by our panelists, and also the hardworking team here at the Forum Secretariat in Suva, as well as the Pacific Islands Forum Geneva office for their hard work and support, as well as representatives from DFAT who collaborated with us to make this event a success. Thank you very much. We wish you a blessed morning, afternoon, and an evening ahead. Thank you.